The Lowy Institute has released its latest version of the Asia Power Index. That's a detailed measure of how countries exert their influence in Asia. Now, rankings show the U.S. as the top power in the region, again, with China not far behind. But the report says America's standing is largely due to China isolating itself for 3 years due to its strict COVID-19 measures. Now, Southeast Asian nations were not overshadowed by superpower rivalry. Singapore, Indonesia and Thailand all ranking in the top 10. Now, the Asia Power Index analyzes 8 factors that show how states use their clout, and they include economic, military capability, as well as diplomatic influence. Let's get more on the report. Joining us now is Susannah Patton, project lead at the Asia Power Index. She is also director of the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute. She joins us from Sydney. Susannah, first, comprehensively, the US did indeed pip China for that top spot. What have they been doing right in the region, and where do the gaps lie?
The US has led China in the Power Index in every year since the index was first launched in 2018. So what that shows is that, contrary to many people's assumptions that China has long ago eclipsed the United States, in fact, the United States has many durable advantages in Asia. One of them in particular is its defence networks. So if we look at the measure of defence networks in the Power Index, we can see that the US is far and away ahead of China, and in fact leads China on 6 out of the 8 measures that we use that you just referred to. So at this point, China's advantage is really primarily in terms of economic relationships.
Indeed. And you mentioned that China did deny the U.S. a clean sweep of all the indicators. But specifically in terms of diplomatic influence in Southeast Asia, where's China lying? Because it did host more leaders from Asia in 2021 than any other country.
That's right. So when it comes to diplomatic influence, the two countries are very close, and China narrowly took the top spot for diplomatic influence in Asia overall in this edition of the Power Index. What that reflects is that the US approach to Asia tends to focus on deep partnerships with a select group of allies and partners. So thinking about countries like Japan, Australia, India, South Korea, whereas China's approach is much broader and potentially shallower, but it means that China has better relations with more countries perhaps than what the United States does in terms of its overall focus on Asia.
So different approaches there. You mentioned Japan. Well, the index shows that Japan's so-called smart power influence is somewhat declining in Asia. It has been trying to position itself more as a full-fledged player in terms of regional security. And we've, of course, seen those key changes to its defense policy. Is that enough to improve its fortunes in Southeast Asia going forward, its pull there?
What the Power Index shows is that Japan's emergence as a security actor in Asia is coming slower than its economic influence. Its traditional sources of influence are being eroded. So the data shows very clearly that Japan is rapidly becoming a less important source of trade and also investment for countries in Asia, which is having a profound impact on Japan's regional influence. And yes, Japan is stepping up in the security dimension, but only very slowly. And actually, this is the first edition of the Power Index since 2018, where Japan actually increased its military capability. So some of those investments are going to be quite slow to bear fruit.
Now, of course, we have to look at the countries closer home within Southeast Asia. The report shows that Southeast Asia is being diplomatically dynamic more so than ever. We've seen, ASEAN foreign leaders expressing a need to be more forthcoming in their South China Sea and Myanmar plans. And then we've got Indonesia, who's playing host to the G20 summit in Bali. Is this a sign of the region's influence growing perhaps further on the world stage?
I think so. Many analysts from outside Southeast Asia have a view that the region is not particularly dynamic and is struggling to respond to the challenges of great power competition. But what our data actually shows is that most of the Southeast Asian countries, especially the larger and wealthier ones, are highly networked, are highly diplomatically active, far from the stereotype of being caught between the superpowers. And Indonesia in particular continues to improve its scores in terms of overall power, but also diplomatic influence. And I think that does reflect some of Indonesia's recent activism, like on Myanmar and also Russia, Ukraine.
I wonder if the data that you found, the results that you found, also inform, as a final question, how Southeast Asia should perhaps endure the power struggles of the US and China that's playing out in its own backyard.
Well, I think one of the lessons of the Power Index is that US-China competition is here to stay, because what the data shows very clearly is that we're not in a position where China is about to push the US out or the other way around. And the two each have their own enduring advantages. US primarily in terms of security partnerships, China in terms of economic relationships. So if there's one lesson to take away, I think it's the fact that this kind of great power competition is something that's here to stay, and we all need to live with it.
Susannah Patton, thank you so much for your thoughts there. She is, of course, the project lead on the Asia Power Index.